China's future, though still rooted in the long sedimentation of its civilizational past, stands today at the edge of a transformation so profound that even the deepest reservoirs of its historical memory appear insufficient to predict what it will become. To state simply that China will be different from its past is obvious, almost trivial. Every civilization that undergoes a technological revolution becomes something other than what it once was. Yet the Chinese case is philosophically singular, because the civilization that for thousands of years conceived itself as the Middle Kingdom, complete in moral cosmology, self-contained in cultural logic, restrained in territorial ambition, has now stepped across the threshold of a world defined not by metaphysical order, but by scientific will. This shift from metaphysical centrality to scientific centrality is not merely a political transition. It is a civilizational metamorphosis, and it demands to be understood through a framework that is historical, philosophical, and geopolitical at once. For most of its recorded history, China's self-understanding was shaped not by outward expansion, but by inward cultivation. Unlike the European powers whose modern identities were forged through colonial conquest, mercantilist expansion, and maritime domination, China conceptualized the world as a hierarchy of moral proximity rather than a geography of opportunities. The Confucian state did not seek to replicate itself across oceans. Rather, it aimed to maintain the harmony of the world within the sphere of its own normative order. Even the Great Ming voyages, so often invoked in contemporary debates, were not imperial expeditions in the European sense. They were not attempts to seize foreign lands, extract wealth, or extend administrative control. They were gestures of prestige, theatrical demonstrations of cosmic centrality. As one commentator famously phrased it, "We built the Great Wall to keep the barbarians out," implying that the civilization's primary instinct was defensive, not expansionist. China expanded when geopolitically necessary, defended itself when threatened, but rarely transformed foreign territories into distant colonies governed by settlers or joint stock companies in the European manner. Yet something in the Chinese psyche fractured under the weight of the 19th and early 20th centuries. The Opium Wars, unequal treaties, spheres of influence, the dismemberment of the Qing Empire, the Japanese invasion, and the extended period that is now remembered as the Century of Humiliation, collectively altered China's relationship to the outside world. A civilization that for millennia viewed itself as the axis of human order, suddenly encountered a West whose military technology, industrial power, and political ruthlessness overwhelmed its self-image. In this encounter, China experienced not only geopolitical defeat, but a philosophical shattering. It was not merely the loss of cities or ports, it was the collapse of a world view. The world no longer mirrored China's moral hierarchy. The world was no longer organized according to the Confucian grammar of harmony. It was instead governed by power, technology, and the unrelenting logic of modernity. This encounter planted two seeds, anguish and ambition. The anguish came from humiliation, from the memory of foreign occupation and the desecration of Chinese sovereignty. The ambition came from a recognition that survival in the modern world required mastery of the forces that had once subordinated China. Thus began a century-long transformation in which China redefined its identity from a metaphysical civilization into a scientific one. This deeper shift is illuminated by Joseph Needham's famous question: why did China, despite its early scientific and technological brilliance, fail to produce the scientific revolution that occurred in Europe? Needham's question was not merely historical, it contained within it an implicit judgment that China's civilizational grammar was once rational, proto-scientific, innovative, until some structural inhibition set in. Needham believed that Chinese civilization possessed the intellectual precursors to modern science, but lacked the institutional and philosophical conditions that allowed science to become autonomous and self-reinforcing. the China of today sees itself as having thrown off these constraints. It no longer locates legitimacy in the moral cosmology of the past, but in the scientific and technological mastery that will shape the future. This is not merely modernization. It is civilizational refoundation. The old restraint, territorial, political, philosophical, has been cast aside, replaced by a forward-driving impulse grounded in national rejuvenation, technological superiority, and a deep desire to never again be subordinated by foreign powers. To understand this transformation philosophically, one must draw from Hegel's idea of world history, in which civilizations become agents of universal history when they internalize contradictions that force them beyond themselves. China, for millennia, was what Hegel would call stationary civilization. Not primitive, not stagnant, but internally complete, lacking the contradictions necessary to propel it into world historical action. But the century of humiliation imposed a contradiction so severe that it awakened China into historical becoming. Through defeat, the dialectic reactivated. Through humiliation, China re-entered world history. Yet the story does not end with Hegel. Toynbee would describe this awakening as a classic case of a civilization responding to challenge. Spengler would frame it as the resurgence of a cultural organism that refuses to die quietly. Weber might see it as the rationalization of Chinese society around a new ethic of efficiency and calculation. Arrighi would interpret China's rise as the latest systemic cycle of accumulation, a new hegemon emerging as the capitalist world system transitions from American dominance. And the geopolitical realists, especially Mearsheimer, would insist that China, having been humiliated and having now accumulated power, cannot help but seek regional and eventually global dominance. Combining all these perspectives illuminates the full magnitude of China's transformation. A civilization that once refused to colonize, now imagines a world shaped by its technological and political leadership. A culture that once retreated behind walls now builds belt and road corridors across continents. A state that once looked inward now speaks the language of destiny. The deeper question is whether China carries a historical grudge that will shape its behavior as it approaches superpower status. The memory of humiliation is not an academic theme in China. It is politically institutionalized, emotionally internalized, and repeatedly invoked. The West's role in China's suffering is etched into national consciousness, framing the international order not as a neutral structure, but as the architecture of past oppressors. Thus, the future of China is inseparable from its desire to settle accounts with history, not necessarily through revenge, but through the assertion of a new world order in which China is no longer a victim, but the architect. The Pacific, today the meeting ground of Chinese ambition and American dominance, holds within it the possibility of an epic confrontation. If such a confrontation occurs, it will not be a war over territory alone. It will be a philosophical clash between two civilizational trajectories, one born from expansion, the other awakened through humiliation. The China that emerges from this process will be fundamentally different from all its past incarnations. The old cosmology is gone. The old geographic modesty is gone. The restraints that once kept China within natural boundaries, philosophical, cultural, and strategic, have been overcome. What remains is a civilization reborn not through inward cultivation, but through technological will. This transformation places China at the center of a global future in which power flows, not from metaphysical order, but from artificial intelligence, quantum revolution, biotech mastery, and planetary infrastructure. China's rise is therefore not merely geopolitical, it is civilizational. It is the re-entry of a once stationary civilization into the storm of world historical becoming, armed not with Confucian virtues, but with supercomputers, hypersonic missiles, and a memory of humiliation that burns like a wound in the collective psyche. The future China will not resemble the ancient empire that sought harmony above expansion. It will not resemble the medieval kingdom that walled itself against barbarians. Nor will it resemble the early modern state that declined in the face of European aggression. It will be a new entity, forged by science, sharpened by historical pain, and propelled by a conviction that the world must be reordered so that China never again falls prey to foreign domination. Whether this future leads to peace or conflict will depend not only on China's choices, but on whether the existing world powers recognize that a civilization so deeply transformed cannot be contained within the frameworks of the past. To understand China's future, one must enter the depths of its civilizational soul, where humiliation and ambition have fused into a new philosophical force. The China that emerges from this fusion is unlike any China the world has ever known, and it carries within it the potential to reshape global history in ways that are both unprecedented and irreversible. For the engine of its ascent is not territory or ideology, but the relentless logic of science and technology, which transforms civilizations not by persuasion but by inevitability. And so the question that remains is whether a world built on older principles can withstand the arrival of a power whose inner transformation has stripped away all the constraints that once kept it inward, looking, as China now steps fully into the realm of world-making, no longer content to exist merely as a participant in the global order, but increasingly positioning itself as the gravitational center around which new forms of political, economic, and technological life might revolve. The shift is not only strategic, it is psychological and metaphysical. For centuries, China viewed the world through a cosmology of concentric circles, with the Middle Kingdom at the center and barbarians at the periphery. Today, those circles have dissolved, replaced by networks, algorithms, and supply chains that bind continents into a single fabric. Instead of radiating moral order, China radiates infrastructure, investment, and technological systems that weave themselves into the daily functioning of societies far from its borders. In this sense, China's global extension is not colonial in the European sense, but systemic, less about territory and more about embedding other nations into Chinese design structures. This shift reflects a deeper transformation in the Chinese mind, the realization that in the age of global interdependence, true power lies not in the conquest of land, but in the creation of environments in which other states must operate. Europe once built empires with cannon and fleets. China builds influence with data cables, ports, satellites, and 5G towers. Yet the philosophical core is the same. To shape the world in one's own image is to assert civilizational agency. And for the first time in centuries, China believes it is entitled to such agency. It believes the time has come not only to correct historical injustices, but to resume a place in world leadership that was, from its perspective, stolen. The psychological shift becomes clearer when one examines China's relationship with science and technology. Before the 19th century, Chinese innovation was immense, but not self-accelerating. It produced inventions, but not scientific revolutions. Needham argued that the Confucian worldview lacked the metaphysical assumptions about nature, causality, experiment, and law that Europe inherited from Greek rationalism and Christian theology. But China of the 21st century has abandoned these earlier constraints. It has adopted the Western scientific method, integrated it into national policy, industrial strategy, and educational systems, and fused it with a civilizational intensity few nations can match. The result is a form of technological nationalism that treats science not merely as knowledge, but as destiny. This reorientation is also driven by memory. The century of humiliation taught China that technological inferiority produces political subjugation. Every Chinese schoolchild is taught the lesson through images of the Opium Wars, the burning of the Summer Palace, and the Japanese occupation. Thus, science today is not simply a tool of development, but a shield against recurrence. China's rise is therefore not cold and mechanical. It is emotional, almost redemptive. The drive towards superpower status is charged with the energy of past disgrace, the determination to ensure that China will never again be lectured, invaded, partitioned, or humiliated. Such historical experiences shape the psychology of states in ways that are often overlooked by Western analysts. The West imagines China primarily through the language of strategy and economics, but China understands itself through the language of memory and destiny. It is not merely rising, it is returning. It is not expanding, it is restoring. It is not challenging the West, it is correcting history. These self-perceptions matter because they give moral legitimacy to ambitions that might otherwise seem aggressive. When China builds ships, missiles, artificial intelligence systems, or deep space instruments, it does so under the implicit belief that these achievements are part of a grand historical rectification. To understand this fully, one must see how China synthesizes trauma and aspiration. The trauma is the memory of humiliation. The aspiration is the dream of rejuvenation, encapsulated in the phrase, the great revival of the Chinese nation. But rejuvenation is not merely economic growth. It is the return of China as a world-making power. And world-making power requires more than wealth. It requires the capacity to shape international norms, build global institutions, and possess the kind of scientific technological base that generates structural influence. China's leaders understand this. The Belt and Road Initiative, dominance in rare earths, breakthroughs in quantum computing, AI governance frameworks, the construction of parallel financial systems, and the development of blue water naval power are not isolated policies. They are components of a single civilizational project to make the world compatible with Chinese power. Thus, China's rise does not replicate European colonialism, but neither does it resemble its ancient self. It is something new, a hybrid of technological prowess, civilizational confidence, geopolitical ambition, and historical grievance. Western observers, who search for parallels in the Han Dynasty or Ming Dynasty, misunderstand the transformation. China is becoming something that has no precedent in its own history. It is no longer confined to the continental mindset that defined most of its existence. It is building maritime power, space power, cyber power, and informational power on a scale no previous Chinese dynasty ever imagined. It is not merely a nation-state, but a civilizational actor equipped with the full machinery of modernity. From a philosophical perspective, this is the moment when China transitions from Hegel's stationary civilization into a force that generates new world historical dynamics. Hegel believed that civilizations enter world history when they embody a universal principle that reshapes the global order. Europe entered history through freedom and rationality, manifesting in the nation-state, the rule of law, and scientific inquiry. China enters history through a different principle, the fusion of civilization and technology. It does not articulate a universal philosophy of freedom, but it embodies a universal principle of efficiency, scale, and systemic integration. Whereas Europe expanded outward through conquest, China expands through connectivity. Whereas Europe proclaimed rights, China proclaims development. Whereas Europe justified empire through enlightenment, China justifies its rise through rejuvenation. These differences are not superficial. They are the deep grammar of China's future behavior. Yet beneath this philosophical transformation lies a geopolitical reality. The world has never experienced the rise of a state with China's combination of civilizational depth, technological ambition, demographic scale, and historical grievance. Mearsheimer insists that great powers inevitably seek regional hegemony as a prelude to global influence. In China's case, the logic seems unavoidable. If China becomes the undisputed hegemon of Asia, its next step will be to reshape the Pacific Order, which brings it into direct conflict with the United States. And if conflict arises, it will be driven not merely by power but by incompatible visions of global order. The Pacific may become the theatre where the final contradictions of the post-1945 world are resolved. The contradiction between an American-led liberal system and a Chinese-led developmental system, between individualist ethos and civilizational ethos, between a declining maritime hegemon and a rising continental maritime hybrid. The possibility of an epic war in the Pacific cannot be dismissed, for it is woven into the architecture of the international system. The United States cannot accept a rival that threatens its primacy. China cannot accept a system built by the very powers that once humiliated it. Both see themselves as rightful stewards of global order. Both see the other as a structural obstacle to historical destiny. If war comes, it will not be accidental. It will be the culmination of two civilizational trajectories whose paths can no longer be reconciled within a single hierarchical order. Yet China is not blindly aggressive. It is strategic, calculating, and deeply aware of the consequences of miscalculation. Its ambition is not reckless expansion but controlled ascent. But ambition shaped by memory has a dangerous sharpness. The last great power to combine humiliation with technological awakening was Japan in the early 20th century, and its trajectory brought catastrophe. China is not Japan, but history offers lessons for those who listen. As China moves deeper into the 21st century, it steps into a role that neither the West nor China itself has fully understood. The role of a civilization reborn in the furnace of modernity, armed with technology, sharpened by humiliation, animated by destiny, and no longer constrained by the boundaries that once defined it. The China of the future will not resemble the China of the past. It will be larger in ambition, broader in scope, more assertive in purpose, and more deeply embedded in the technological forces that shape the modern world. Its emergence will confront humanity with a new form of power, one that is neither Western nor ancient, neither imperialist in the old sense nor isolationist in the Confucian sense. It is the power of a civilization that has awakened to the full force of historical becoming, determined never again to be pushed to the margins of global life, and prepared, if necessary, to challenge the existing order until it reflects the dignity and destiny that China believes were denied to it for far too long. Yet this is not a simple story of national pride or geopolitical competition. It is a civilizational drama, unfolding across centuries, driven by forces far deeper than policy documents or diplomatic speeches. To understand China's future, one must enter the long arc of its historical consciousness. For China does not think in decades or administrations. It thinks in dynastic cycles, cosmic rhythms, and the slow transformations of civilization. The humiliation of the 19th century is not, for China, a past event. It is a wound that still bleeds in memory, shaping its sense of the present. And its technological rise is not seen as ambition, but as restoration, the return of an ancient balance disrupted by foreign intrusion. This self-perception creates a unique form of modernity. Unlike Western modernity, which emerged from the breakdown of medieval religious order, Chinese modernity emerges from the collapse of historical continuity. In Europe, modernity was a rebellion against tradition. In China, modernity is the mechanism through which tradition reasserts itself. The West equates modernity with individualism, rights, and rational autonomy. China equates modernity with national rejuvenation, collective stability, and technological mastery. The West sees progress as the expansion of liberty, China sees progress as the strengthening of the state and the perfection of social order. These differences are not mere ideological contrasts. They are the deep structure of two distinct civilizational logics now colliding within a single global system. As China's technological power accelerates, these differences will become sharper. Artificial intelligence, for example, is not simply a tool, but a mirror that reflects a society's values. Western AI research is constrained by debates on privacy, ethics, and individual rights. Chinese AI research is oriented toward efficiency, governance, and social management. In Europe, AI is seen as potentially dangerous if too integrated into daily life. In China, it is seen as a necessary instrument to perfect the functioning of a super-complex society. These differences in technological philosophy will shape the global future, for the world will soon be divided not by territory, but by technological ecosystems. And China is constructing one that aligns with its own civilizational priorities. This ecosystem is vast. It includes telecommunications, robotics, quantum encryption, surveillance architecture, supply chain dominance, renewable energy networks, and space-based infrastructure. It is not imperial in the classical sense. It is imperial in the infrastructural sense. Instead of occupying foreign lands, China occupies the technological arteries through which information, goods, capital, and even political influence flow. It builds ports in the Indian Ocean, rail networks in Eurasia, data centers in Africa, and satellite corridors over Latin America. These are not random investments. They are the connective tissues of a new Sino-centric world system. 8. Arrighi would argue that China represents the next cycle of global hegemony, following the Genoese, Dutch, British, and American cycles. But China's ascent differs from all the previous ones in its scale and civilizational depth. No previous hegemon combined the population of a continent, the historical memory of an empire, and the technological ambition of a modern industrial state. China is not simply another rising power. It is the return of a civilizational entity into the heart of global modernity. And because it returns with the wounds of humiliation, its rise is charged with emotional energy that magnifies its geopolitical momentum. The West, however, often misunderstands this. American policymakers interpret China's rise through the logic of the Cold War, assuming that containment, alliances, and deterrence can restrain it. But China's motivations are not Soviet. China is not driven by ideological expansionism. It is driven by civilizational restoration. It does not seek to export communism or impose Chinese culture on the world. It seeks recognition of its historical identity and respect for its technological sovereignty. Yet this pursuit inevitably generates conflict because the existing order, liberal, American-led, maritime, cannot easily accommodate a power whose ascent undermines its foundational assumptions. This contradiction grows sharper in the Pacific. The Pacific is not only a body of water, it is a psychological frontier, the boundary between two civilizational visions of order. For the United States, it is the space through which it projects maritime power and maintains global primacy. For China, it is the ocean through which foreign powers once entered to humiliate the Middle Kingdom. The Pacific is therefore a symbolic space charged with historical tension. If conflict erupts, it will not be because of disagreements over islands or trade routes, but because the Pacific represents the intersection of two incompatible historical trajectories. The United States seeks to preserve the order it built. China seeks to overturn the memory of an order that once shattered its dignity. Yet the most profound transformation is internal, not external. China's self-image has changed. For thousands of years, Chinese civilization believed that the correct ordering of the world emerged from moral cultivation, hierarchy, and harmony. But the events of the 19th and 20th centuries taught China that the world is shaped by power, not virtue. This realization is the deepest philosophical shift in modern Chinese history. It is not merely the adoption of Western technology, it is the abandonment of an ancient cosmology. China no longer seeks harmony with the world, it seeks leverage over it. It no longer believes that virtue commands respect, it believes that strength commands respect. It no longer imagines itself as a moral center, it imagines itself as a technological superpower. In the centuries before the Opium Wars, Chinese emperors could not comprehend that European envoys represented sovereign states rather than tribute-bearing vassals. Today, Chinese leaders cannot comprehend why a declining West insists on maintaining a global order that no longer reflects the distribution of power. In both cases, China struggled to understand the mentality of foreigners. But the difference is this. Today, China believes it understands the world better than the world understands itself. It believes that Western power is decaying, that Western democracy is unstable, and that the future of global leadership lies in a new model, one that China is uniquely positioned to define. This confidence will shape the coming decades. The China of the future will be expansive, assertive, and deeply invested in reshaping global structures. Its ambitions will not be limited to Asia. They will span the entire world. And because China's rise is supported by systems, not armies, its influence will be more subtle, more pervasive, and more enduring than the crude empires of the past. It will not conquer territories. It will embed itself into the infrastructures that sustain life. It will not rule people. It will shape the environments within which they live. What emerges from this is a vision of China unlike any in the last 5,000 years, a China unrestrained by the modesty of emperors, awakened from the trauma of humiliation, elevated by the power of science, and propelled by a civilizational ambition to reorganize the world so that it never again suffers the indignities of the past. Such a China is not simply a state, it is a philosophical force, a historical momentum, a technological titan, and a civilization determined to become the architect of the next global order. Titi. What emerges from this is a vision of China unlike any in the last 5,000 years, a China unrestrained by the modesty of emperors, awakened from the trauma of humiliation, elevated by the power of science, and propelled by a civilizational ambition to reorganize the world so that it never again suffers the indignities of the past. Such a China is not simply a state. It is a philosophical force, a historical momentum, a technological titan, and a civilization determined to become the architect of the next global order. But to grasp the significance of this civilizational awakening, one must shift from the geopolitical to the philosophical. What the world is witnessing is not merely the rise of a powerful state, it is the re-entry of ancient metaphysical worlds into the modern arena, each carrying its own conception of order, human nature, authority, and destiny. The return of China therefore signals the return of a different idea of history itself. History not as the Western drama of self-liberation, but as the restoration of harmony through centralized power, the return of cosmic order through political unity, the rebirth of a world where the state is not an arbiter among individuals, but the axis around which all human life revolves. This is where the deeper transformation of the world begins. Because China's resurgence is not an isolated phenomenon. It is a symptom of a broader movement in which multiple ancient civilizations, Chinese, Indic, Persianate, Islamic, Slavic, are reawakening from their historical dormancy, each with its own metaphysical grammar now seeking modern expression. The 20th century belonged to the West because it was the only civilization that fully translated its inner philosophical architecture, individualism, rationality, scientific method, political pluralism, into global institutions. The 21st century belongs to no single civilization because that the world is becoming a theatre where multiple civilizational logics are again active, conscious, and politically consequential. What we call multipolarity is merely the surface expression of this deeper tectonic shift. Beneath it lies a more profound contest, a struggle between different theories of what the world is and what human beings are for. The old Western idea that history is a story of progressive self-emancipation now confronts civilizational traditions that see history not as liberation, but as restoration, not as the triumph of the individual, but as the recovery of sacred order, not as the self-determination of man, but as the reassertion of cosmic or communal unity. In such a world, modernity itself becomes contested. The Western Enlightenment view, where reason dethrones tradition, where the individual replaces the tribe, where the critique of power is the foundation of political freedom, is no longer the uncontested model. Other civilizations now reinterpret modernity through their own metaphysical frameworks. Some see technology not as a tool for individual empowerment, but as an instrument for the perfection of centralized authority. Others view economic development not as liberation from hierarchy, but as a means to reinforce it. Still others imagine the global order not as a society of equal states, but as a hierarchy patterned after ancient imperial cosmologies. Thus, the most important fact of the 21st century is not the decline of the West or the rise of China. It is the pluralization of historical reason. Modernity is no longer a single project. It has become the arena where multiple civilizational projects compete to define what it means to be modern. The planet is entering an era in which ancient metaphysics wear the garments of scientific progress, in which technological achievement is infused with cultural memory, and in which global power is driven by visions of destiny that reach far beyond the West's secular self-understanding. This is the scale at which the argument must be framed. The story is not about nations, but about the reactivation of long-dormant civilizational energies. China is simply the most visible manifestation of this phenomenon, but the deeper process is universal. The world is reorganizing around civilizational identities that had for 2 centuries been suppressed under the shadow of Western hegemony. The 21st century is the century of civilizational re-entry into history. And once this is understood, the central philosophical question emerges with clarity. What happens when multiple civilizations awaken simultaneously, each asserting its own vision of order? We are living through the early chapters of that answer.